So good morning, everyone. This morning we'll go to the last of the shamatha practices that we're going to be doing in this course. So remember again, this shamatha practice is the practice of cultivating a calm, clear and focused mind. In other words, developing our attention skills. And we began that by using the breath as the object, the sensations of the breath. Probably the object is most widely emphasized in most Buddhist traditions. And then yesterday we looked at the practice of shamatha practice of observing the mind. In other words, to observe our thoughts, emotions and so forth in the mind. And today we're going to go to what's called awareness, sometimes called shamatha with no object. Because with the breath practice, of course, we are aware of the sensations of the breath. With the mind practice, we're aware of our thoughts and emotions and so forth. And with this practice, what we're doing is we're simply turning awareness in upon itself and just knowing that we're aware. Many people find this even more challenging than observing thoughts and emotions, but not because it's difficult, not because it's complicated, but actually because it's too simple. It's too simple. Because this practice basically involves doing nothing. We don't know how to do nothing. We always want to do something. So when this practice is explained, then sometimes people say, yeah, but what am I supposed to do? Tell me what I've got to do. Doing is the problem. Stop doing. This practice is about being. It's simply knowing that we're aware. That's it. So let's just do a little 5-second experiment of knowing that we're aware, starting now. Was that difficult? Did you pass out? Did you get completely caught up in distraction? Did you know that you were aware? That's it. That's the practice. Nothing more than that. People say, no, there's got to be something more than that. That's it. That is the practice. Of course, the challenge is to not get caught up in any appearances. Of course, in this practice, thoughts, emotions, sounds, sensations will continue to arise. And of course, we're not trying to block them, but we're simply not interested in them. We're not paying any attention to them at all. Let them be there. They can be there. We're just not interested in them. The only thing we're interested in is knowing that we're aware. That's it. So like the breath practice and the mind practice from yesterday, the goal of this practice is to cultivate a calm, clear and focused mind. But this variation of shamatha practice has also, for us, particularly in the modern world, enormous side benefits. And one of the enormous side benefits for this practice is that it helps us to get out of this obsessive, compulsive doing mode that we seem to be trapped in all day long. Do. And it can get us into being mode. So that's already a good advantage. And what we notice is that if we can simply know that we're aware and just rest in that experience of awareness itself, what you notice is awareness is completely still and it's completely open and spacious. Because now what we do is we contract around appearances. Our mind, our default mode in daily life is our mind is very tight and constricted. And then when some little stimulus comes in daily life, we react. Attachment, aversion, jealousy. This is our default mode, stimulus reaction, all day long. Whereas if we can develop this or cultivate this shamatha practice, what we can bring into daily life is a new default mode. Instead of this tight, constricted, reactionary mind, we can bring an open, spacious, still mind as our default mode in daily life. So I like to use the analogy of a cup with water. Because our mind is very tight and constricted now, it's like the water in this cup, which means if we drop a little pebble in the cup of water, the surface gets completely disturbed. Likewise in daily life now, because our mind is very tight and constricted, some little stimulus comes, we easily get disturbed, reaction. But if we do this practice, what our mind in daily life will be like the water in a large, still lake. So if we drop that same little pebble in a big, still lake, there's hardly a ripple. Similarly, if we do this practice, we can bring this state of mind as our default mode in daily life, which means if that same stimulus comes, we can be fully present with it without getting imbalanced and react to it. And another great benefit with this practice is that by simply resting in that awareness, knowing that we're aware, we can intuitively come to an insight into the very nature of our mind, which of course is Vipassana practice. So even though this is actually a shamatha practice, it's very much known as a bridge into Vipassana practice. So these are some of the benefits for this practice. Like yesterday's practice, it's very much recommended in this practice to have the eyes open, either naturally or partially, for the same reasons. Improves clarity, helps us to stay in the present moment, can therefore also be able to more easily transition this into daily life, and also starts to break down this false sense of duality. One last comment before we go to the practice. In all shamatha practices, of course, the basis is relaxation, even more so for this practice. The more relaxed you are, the easier this practice will be. The harder you try in this practice, the more difficult it becomes. So we really need to really have this super relaxed body and mind. Again, if we try hard in this practice, it's going to be nearly impossible to do this practice. So just release, release, release everything.
Can we not like full on slouch then, but can we, instead of sitting up really straight, can we kind of...
And of course, when we're sitting upright, we're not sort of rigid like this. This is not a good posture because it's straining. Usually when we're straining like that, it's because we're not flexible and we're not sitting on enough cushions and we're straining to keep the back straight. And of course we're not trying to, so we need to be relaxed in that posture. If you're straining to keep the back straight, then probably most of us, because we have work where we're sitting like this all day, naturally our spine is sort of curved because of doing that all day at work. So then I would really suggest to do some body work in terms of yoga and stretching and so forth, and really, in daily life in general, try to establish a better posture. That's going to be helpful in daily life. But certainly here we don't want to be straining to keep the back straight. Then we need to change something. Okay, let's do the practice. So we'll do a 15-minute practice. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. relaxing more deeply with each out-breath. With each out-breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen, happily releasing them. And allowing the mind to come to rest in the present moment. And simply becoming aware of the rhythm of the breath. Allowing the eyes to be at least partially open, resting your gaze in the space in front of you. And then simply release all appearances and allow the mind to come to rest. Not doing anything at all. Simply being present. Knowing that you're aware. All sorts of appearances will continue to arise. Thoughts, emotions, sounds, sensations, and so on. But now pay no attention to any appearance. We're not trying to block them. Let them be there. We're just not interested in them. The only thing we're interested in is knowing that we're aware. If you find that you're getting caught up in any agitation, tension, or distraction, lower your gaze, release awareness into space, releasing all appearances and relaxing completely. Or if you're finding that you're simply falling into dullness or drowsiness, elevate your gaze and sharpen your focus, knowing that you're aware. And simply rest in that open, spacious stillness of awareness. And if you're completely lost in this practice, go back into the body and anchor yourself in the rhythm of the breath. So have that as your main focus. And just a little bit in the corner of the mind, notice the stillness that surrounds and pervades the rhythm of the breath. questions about our practice before we go to this morning's topic? I didn't hear what you said, sorry, speak up. I have not done any Zazen meditation, so I don't know.
When you do this practice a lot, the world is kind of changing around you. How can you get used to that?
So the question is, if you do this practice a lot, the world changes around
You
you?
feel the world differently.
Sorry?
You feel the world differently.
Differently. In what sense?
Sorry?
In what sense is it different?
Difficult to explain.
In a positive sense?
Yes, just different. Just you are, as you are more present, so you are more conscious.
Mm-hmm.
So you feel the things differently.
Yeah.
And how can you get used to this?
Like everything, just practice. I mean, you get used to everything. What we need to be careful of in this practice is what we're doing is, in this practice, of course, we're just resting in awareness. We're not interested in appearances. In other words, we're not chasing after appearances. Sometimes people use this practice as a way of escaping. So this is not healthy. So this practice is not about escaping from the world. It's about learning, like you said, learning how to be better in the world, to be in a better, have a better perspective of the world. And as you said, is that if you do this practice well, you will find that. You'll find that, like you said, you'll be much more present, more calm. Already just this will make a very positive impact in our daily life. But of course, from a Buddhist perspective, there's more to do than just this. But this would be, like I said, this practice, one of the big side benefits is it gives us a new default mode in daily life. And with that new default mode, already the life tends to be better, but then from that basis we can do a lot more. And that's what's going to come today and tomorrow.
How is it different from just observing five senses and everything that's happening in the mind?
Because in this one we're not interested in any appearances.
Well, just like not interested observation.
No, we're not observing anything in this. We're only, thoughts and so if you're doing this practice well, you won't notice anything else. Even if there's thoughts and sounds and sensations, if you're really in this practice, you won't even notice them. Now, of course, we notice them because our mindfulness is not very good. So we're trying to do this, and then a sound comes, and then we sort of go there a bit and come back, and then a thought comes, we go there and back. But the better it won't register. It's a little bit like, now maybe you're at home and you're absorbed in reading a good book, and someone's at home talking to you. Sound waves are hitting your eardrum, but you go, did you say something? Because you're so focused on the book. So similarly here, if we're really in that space, all of these things can be there and we won't notice them. So that's the big difference between the other one. The other one, we are actually paying attention to everything that's there. That is our focus. Our focus here is where we're focusing just on awareness itself.
And how to transition from observing mode into just completely unaware, or aware but paying attention to the actual content of.
Right, so the thing is that then if we can develop this practice, we can have that as our default mode, and then we are in control. Meaning if something appears, we decide whether or not to engage in that. Now, of course, we're not in control, the mind is in control, something appears, we go there, and usually in a very reactive way. So we're the slaves of our mind. So with this, it'll really help us to become the masters of our mind, because we can be in that state. It's like the analogy of a car. Now a car is always in gear and it's always wanting to go somewhere, and we have to keep the foot on the brake to stop it from going somewhere, and it's hard. Whereas this practice is about putting it in neutral, which means there can be still lots of things going on, but we're not sort of struggling to hold back all of that. We're just there. And then if we're in that state and then something comes up and we find it that useful to go and follow that and do something, then we put it in gear, but we're in control. We put it in gear and go, and then we put it out again. Now it's always in gear and we're sort of thrown around everywhere.
So you know, like the thought, the observation of thoughts and emotions, you can like note. Can you, with this one, note awareness, or is that just another thought? For this one I think that's, because that's, again, that's really going off. So I think with this one is if we just come back, just come back to the awareness. If we get caught up in something. But you can't like say to yourself, like awareness.
Again, in all of these practices, it's like everything in our life. When we're learning something, a little bit of commentary can be helpful, even necessary. Like when we're learning to drive a car, you know, what do? We go, okay, now remember to look in the mirror, push that down, push that. We have to remind ourselves what to do, otherwise we're completely lost, because it's not familiar. But then once we learn to drive the car, I mean, we don't now, if we learn to drive the car, we don't keep doing this internal commentary to drive us nuts. We just do it because it's a habit. So similarly with any of these practices, sometimes a bit of commentary can be helpful to remind us of what to do. But of course, as we get into the practice, we'll need to let that go, otherwise it'll become an obstacle. So yes, a little bit of commentary to remind ourselves, like maybe release all appearances, stay relaxed, rest. I mean, a few words now and again to remind us. That's okay, but again, then once we know the practice, we need to let that go, otherwise it becomes an obstacle.
Would you recommend rather starting with the breathing exercise and the observation and then the awareness, or just do the awareness and...
Yeah. The general recommendation for these various shamatha practices is pick the object that works best for you and then stay with that one. But an alternative to that is if we really want to do this practice or observing the mind, the thoughts, and we find it very difficult to get into, then yes, we can start with the breath, a little bit easier, work with that for some weeks or months or longer until we've got into that practice and our mind has become more stable, more clear, more focused. Then shift to this or the other practice, and then you'll find it easier to get into. So you could do that, yes.
I'm getting confused about awareness and mind.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not very sure what is that chatter is going on, is in the mind or is in the awareness.
Awareness and mind, same thing. Same thing.
Okay, so when we direct ourselves, okay, like focus on the thought or focus on something, what is that? That's the part of the mind? Or?
Well, all of these things are appearing in the mind, yes. Same as the sensations of the breath is appearing in the mind. These are all appearances in the mind, yeah.
Okay. So in this practice,
we're not interested in any appearances. Let them be there. We just want to turn awareness upon itself and just know that we're aware. That's it.
not even the chatter, not even the chatter.
Let the chatter be there. We're just not paying any attention to it. We're not trying to block it. Don't try and block it. That's not going to work.
Not even the voice?
No voice. Just ignore it. Ignore voices, chatter, sounds. Ignore it all.
When you say with this practice that you're more in control and you decide if you follow or not the thought, before deciding that, do you analyze the thought? You try to understand where it comes from, why you think of it?
That is more of a Vipassana practice. Whenever we investigate, we've moved from shamatha to Vipassana. Because one of the things that often happens with this and the practice we did yesterday is people are resting there in awareness and then they go, who's doing this? then already we're out of shamatha practice, we've gone into vipassana practice. As soon as we ask a question, we've gone into vipassana. And that is a valid question for vipassana practice, but in this practice that's not the right time to entertain those questions. So if a question comes up, who's doing this? Just ignore it, let it go, and just stay in awareness.
You mentioned that this should be the default disposition. I mean,
Sorry?
eventually we get to a point where
We can have this as a default mode in daily life.
yeah. So that's where you rest every day, and then
Yeah, that can be your default mode. I mean, that's much nicer than blah, 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 blah all day long, isn't it? That's not a very good default mode, and that's generally our default mode. It's constantly blah, 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 blah. It's tiring, isn't it?
When a thought comes to you, so you just wait and...
No, you don't do anything with them. You just don't pay any attention. In this practice, you don't pay any attention to them. You just stay in knowing that you're aware. Just stay there.
Okay, even if something else is going on. Because
Correct.
usually when you say like, bring your attention back...
Yeah, I mean, what will happen as a beginner in this practice, of course, we're resting in awareness, a thought will come and we'll latch onto it. And if that happens, then you just let it go and just come back to resting in awareness.
Yeah, because usually on this and another practice I can do this, but few times a song comes to my mind and it doesn't stop until the song is finished.
Correct. Because you're either getting caught up in it or you're wanting it to go away.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I wanted to stop it.
Exactly. So then if you want it to stop, it won't stop. Because wanting it to stop is aversion. So either following it or wanting it to stop are the two things we don't want to do. So if it's there, just say, okay, it doesn't matter. And just stay with what you're doing. If you want it to stop, then you're caught up in it. Okay, so let's go to this morning's topic. So remember, we are using the Four Noble Truths as the foundation, the framework for all of our discussions. Four Noble Truths, of course, was the very first teaching the Buddha gave after achieving enlightenment. It's the foundation of all Buddhist traditions. In the Four Noble Truths, of course, the Buddha is being like our doctor, first diagnosing our condition. And he said that our condition is one of dukkha. Again, very hard to translate into English. Sometimes translated as suffering, sometimes translated as unsatisfactory state. But what we can understand is that dukkha, the human condition, is that sometimes we have pleasant experiences, sometimes we have unpleasant experiences, but underlying both of those is the fact that there's always a potential for suffering to arise in our life. So this is the sort of the deepest understanding of dukkha, that there's always a potential for suffering to arise in our life. Why are we stuck in this state? The second part of the Buddha's diagnosis was the second noble truth, the cause or origin of dukkha or suffering, and there we saw that it was the mental afflictions. At the deepest level, of course, the fundamental ignorance, our distorted view of reality, is the underlying cause of why we're stuck in this state. And then we used that suffering and its causes chart to show how that led to attachment to pleasant things, aversion to unpleasant things, and that's driving our behaviour, resulting in our current situation. And then yesterday we saw that the Buddhist assertion is that we're not just stuck in this state of dukkha in this life, but we're cycling life after life in this state. And this cycling life after life in this state is called samsara. And we saw how that cycling occurs using that diagram yesterday afternoon, that wheel of life, the Bhava Chakra, particularly those 12 links around the outside. We're showing how from ignorance we are cycling life after life in this cycle of birth, aging and death. But of course the Buddha's prognosis was very good. He said that we can transcend this cycle of existence called samsara. We can be liberated from suffering and its causes. we can achieve this healthy state called nirvana. And how we can achieve that, what is the Buddha's cure or medicine for us, is the fourth noble truth, of course, the truth of the path leading to the cessation of suffering. And so that's what I'd like to begin to cover today, is the third and fourth noble truth, the truth of cessation and the truth of the path leading to the cessation of suffering. And to do that, we're going to use this three vehicles chart that you have. So we said that these Four Noble Truths teachings are really the core of what's now called the modern day, the Theravada Buddhist traditions. That when Buddhism spread from India through the Pali language, the core teachings that spread were these Four Noble Truths teachings, spreading into Sri Lanka and then up through Southeast Asia, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand and so forth. So these traditions now are collectively called the Theravada Buddhist traditions, based on these Four Noble Truths teachings. And so here the third noble truth, the truth of cessation of suffering, this healthy state of being completely liberated from suffering and its causes, is referred to as nirvana. And we saw the etymology of this word nirvana yesterday afternoon. That it has sort of two etymologies. One is that the nirvana is the act of fully cooling. So we saw the symbolism of the moon. That when we achieve the goal of nirvana, the mind is cooled from the torment of the mental afflictions. Just like the light of the moon is cooling, whereas the light of the sun is tormenting us, the heat of the sun. And the other one was that nirvana is the act of fully blowing out as in eliminating this contaminated body and the contaminated mind. And if we achieve this healthy state of nirvana, we are referred to as an arhat. The word arhat, sometimes translated into English as foe destroyer, meaning someone who's destroyed the enemy. And of course the enemy here is the mental afflictions. Or we saw in that chart, they're sometimes referred to as the afflictive obscurations. So the afflictive obscurations are what's obscuring us from achieving nirvana. So the mental afflictions. And of course, to strive for this goal of nirvana, first we have to cultivate the aspiration for nirvana. And remember we saw there earlier that that's often translated into English as this word renunciation. But actually this translation is not a very good translation. Someone sort of thought about it some years ago and it sort of stuck. So remember when we see the word renunciation, of course it's based on renounce or to give up. And we're talking about, of course, giving up the 8 worldly concerns. But actually the original Sanskrit term doesn't even really mean that. This nissarana literally means the wish to move out of, away from suffering, towards liberation. So actually the word Nisarana is really the wish for liberation from suffering. So that is the aspiration we're cultivating here, the wish to be free of suffering, understanding that we can eliminate all suffering and its causes. So it's really the wish to be liberated, the wish to achieve nirvana. Then, of course, having developed that aspiration for the goal of nirvana, then what is the medicine? What the truth of the path leading to the cessation of suffering? So what practices do we need to engage in to achieve that goal? And so here we see in this chart, this is usually presented as this noble eightfold path. And so we see there right speech, right action, right livelihood, and so forth. And as we see in the chart, and I think we already briefly mentioned earlier, is that all these 8 practices can be condensed into 3 main core areas of practice, called the 3 higher trainings. The first of those is ethics, which of course here subsumes right speech, right action, right livelihood. Shila in Sanskrit. And we saw here that ethics at this level is really about avoiding harmful behaviour. So the other day we looked at the idea of abandoning these 10 non-virtues. So this is really the core of ethics here, to avoid this harmful behaviour mentally, verbally, physically. And then on that basis, the second area of practice is concentration. In Sanskrit, that is samadhi. And as we briefly saw earlier, we can develop many levels of concentration. The one that we are focusing mainly on in this course is a level of concentration called shamatha. But here in the Theravada traditions, when this concentration practice is explained, you probably will never hear the word shamatha. Rather, you'll hear the word jhana. So jhana is also another level of samadhi. And so that's the level of samadhi that is focused on in the Theravada traditions. And actually there are 4 levels of jhana that we can cultivate. But whether we use the word jhana or shamatha, it's the same practice, developing single-pointed concentration. And then on that basis, the third core area of practice, of course, is wisdom. Wisdom in Sanskrit is prajna. And often this wisdom practice is referred to using another Sanskrit term, and that is vipassana. And of course, the Pali equivalent is vipassana. And so we saw there that in vipassana or vipassana, the VI prefix means higher, superior. And pasana or pasana means to see. So vipassana or vipassana is higher seeing, seeing beyond, and often translated into English as insight, meaning gaining insight into the nature of reality. And here, in the Theravada tradition, when they talk about wisdom practice or vipassana practice, we are mainly focusing on 3 particular insights called the 3 marks of existence. We see that in the last column. So the first insight that we are cultivating here in Vipassana practice is an insight into impermanence. Anitya in Sanskrit and anicca in Pali. And this insight into impermanence, and of course remember that's probably something we all intellectually accept already, that everything's changing moment by moment. But of course here Vipassana practice is about experiencing this, not just having an intellectual understanding. So Vipassana practice is about bringing intellectual understanding into experience, to come to directly experience the fact that things are changing moment by moment. What will that do for us? What will this insight of impermanence do for us? It will have a dramatic positive impact on us, of course. And we briefly saw yesterday that as an antidote to attachment is impermanence. Because if we can experientially see things as changing moment by moment, otherwise, in other words, everything we experience will experience as in just being in a flow, flowing, then there's nothing for attachment to grab hold of, and there's nothing for aversion to push against. So what you'll find is if you can start to gain this insight experientially, you'll find that your mental afflictions, particularly your attachment aversion, will dramatically decrease. And also, as we're going to see tomorrow, this insight into impermanence is also, as we're going to see now as well, is also leads us to the other insights. Because sometimes people feel like, I really need to realise this no self or this emptiness, so I won't bother with impermanence. I think that's a big mistake. Because this insight is easier to achieve than the other insights, and also this insight is really leads us into the other insights anyway. For example, when this impermanence is presented, it's often presented as things changing moment by moment. And so when we hear that, we often have this idea, well, okay, in the present moment we have a thing, in the next moment it becomes something different, in the next moment it becomes something different. Is that impermanence? Impossible. Impossible. Because if you have a thing existing in the present moment, no matter how short that present moment is, it means during that brief period of time, it's not changing, which means it's not impermanent. And if it didn't change in that brief moment of time, why would it suddenly change? It couldn't. This is not impermanence. This is impermanence. And if we really appreciate this, we're this close to realizing emptiness. This close. So that's the first insight we are gaining here. Then the second insight is an insight into suffering. Of course, suffering here meaning dukkha. So here this insight is to come to an experiential insight to realize the situation we find ourselves in, the condition we find ourselves in. What will that do for us? It'll do a number of things to us. One is, by having this insight, we will experientially realize there's no happiness to be found out there at all. And also, that insight then will lead us to developing this renunciation, the wish to be free. So with this insight, we'll turn our attention inwards and look for the source of happiness and suffering within ourselves and develop this aspiration to be liberated. Once we've developed that, of course, then we need to achieve the goal of nirvana. So that's the third insight will help us to do that. And that's an insight into no self. If we can gain an insight into no self, we can achieve the goal of nirvana. And again, remember here, the word self is an overinflated false sense of me. So no self does not mean no me, no person. There's no Buddhist tradition that says the person, the me, doesn't exist. That's nihilism. The question is, how do we exist? Because if we don't exist, we can't even ask that question. And the Buddhist assertion is that we do not exist in terms of being a self. And we'll look at that in more detail tomorrow, but very briefly, self here means that now there seems to be a me here, and this me seems to be something more than just the body and the mind. There seems to be something a little bit extra than just body and mind here. But we'll talk more about that tomorrow. And the Buddhist assertion is there is nothing extra in addition to the body and the mind. But again, that's going to be a big topic for tomorrow. So these are the 3 marks of existence, which is the core of Vipassana practice here in the Theravada tradition. So that's a brief overview of that. So any questions on that before now I start to look at the Mahayana? Wait.
Vipassana is always analytical meditation?
Yes. Yes.
Are they obscurations the same as the Pali sankharas?
Samskaras is the mental afflictions.
Yeah.
So, well, the afflictive obscurations. But samskaras also, I think, include other things.
Sankhara.
Yeah, the same word.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Shortly repeat once again these 3. Please shortly repeat once again all 3 points.
Yeah. The 3 marks?
Yes.
So in Theravada tradition, when they talk about doing Vipassana practice, they're mainly talking about these 3 practices. Gaining an insight into impermanence, gaining an insight into suffering or dukkha, and gaining an insight into no self. And if we gain an insight into impermanence, what we'll notice is that our mental afflictions, particularly attachment, aversion, will dramatically decrease. If we gain an insight into dukkha or suffering, we're going to stop looking out there for happiness because we'll realise there's no happiness to be found out there. We'll turn attention inwards and we'll start to develop this aspiration to be free of suffering. And then, gaining an insight into no self, the assertion here is that this grasping to self is the fundamental ignorance that is leading to all mental afflictions and suffering. So if we realise there's no such self, we can eliminate all mental afflictions and suffering and achieve the goal of nirvana.
Can you repeat the thing about the thing that's permanent changes from moment to moment? That's not in evidence.
Yeah, this will be more tomorrow, but again, generally when impermanence is described, it says that the description is that means things are changing moment by moment. That's okay to say that, but when we hear that, we often think, oh, okay, that means in the present moment there's a thing, and in the next moment it becomes something different, and in the next moment it becomes something different. That's how we normally conceptualize it. But what I was saying is that that's a very crude understanding. Because if there is a thing existing in the present moment, so moment means a period of time, very short, but if there's a thing existing in a present moment, it means that during that brief period of time, it's not changing. Which means it's not impermanent. And then if it wasn't changing, why would it suddenly change? well, no practical example. It's just that and to really answer this, I have to talk the material for tomorrow. So, we use this idea of impermanence and present moment, but what we're going to see tomorrow is you can't point to the present moment. Present moment is a concept that we've developed to explain things. As long as we know that, then that's okay. But if we grasp onto the present moment as something real, we end up having this idea. Meaning there's really a present moment, and there's a thing existing in the present moment. And of course, if there is a present moment, that means a period of time. Yeah? A moment means a period of time. And if there's a thing existing during that present moment, it means during that brief period of time, it's not changing. Because it's existing during that time. Then it's not impermanent. But more will come tomorrow.
And what happens with the distorted view of reality in that goal of Nirvana?
Well, we've eliminated it. So in the Theravada, this is the distorted view of reality, the deepest one that we need to get rid of. I mean, these are all, just to grasp things as unchanging, to see pleasure as happiness, they're all distorted views. But in Theravada, this is the deepest distortion. So if we realise no self, then in Nirvana, there's no more any distorted view of reality.
A separate object and subject, yes?
Yeah. So here, in this 3 marks of existence, there's no real talk about this idea of emptiness, which we're going to talk about tomorrow. That comes more in the Mahayana, which is what I'm going to look at now. So let's have a look at that now, the Mahayana. So, when Buddhism spread through the Sanskrit language, again it spread over the Himalayas, onto the Silk Route, into China, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and then over Himalayas into Tibet. So those traditions are collectively now called the Mahayana Buddhist traditions. And then the teachings that went through the Sanskrit language, of course, include the Four Noble Truths, but also these perfection of wisdom teachings. And in these perfection of wisdom teachings, the final goal of the spiritual path is said to be enlightenment. And if we achieve this goal of enlightenment, we become known as Buddha. And of course, first we need to cultivate the aspiration for enlightenment. And that aspiration for enlightenment is called bodhicitta. And bodhicitta is a Sanskrit term. Chitta means mind. Bodhi is Sanskrit for enlightenment. So bodhicitta is literally the mind of enlightenment. It's the mind which aspires to enlightenment for the benefit of others. And we'll look at this bodhicitta this afternoon, what it is and how to develop it, how to cultivate it. When we cultivate this aspiration of bodhicitta, we become known as a bodhisattva. So again, bodhisattva is a Sanskrit term. Again, bodhi is enlightenment. Sattva here can have many meanings. Here, sattva means courage or strength. So a bodhisattva is someone who has the courage or strength to strive for enlightenment. And when that bodhisattva achieves enlightenment, they become Buddha. How do we achieve the goal of enlightenment? What are the practices? So here, the most common presentation, as we see in the chart, is the 6 perfections. And so here in the six perfections, we see the first one is generosity, dana in Sanskrit. And generosity is defined as the intention to give. And there are many forms of generosity. One, of course, is to simply give material things. Another one is to give protection, to help protect others. Another one, a form of giving, is to give love or loving kindness. And at the deepest level, generosity is about what's called giving dharma, or in other words, giving advice and guidance to others on the spiritual path. So this is all generosity, all these different types. The second one we see here again is ethics, or shila again. Here in the six perfections, the ethics is more broad. Here, ethics is not simply avoiding harmful behaviour, but it includes also the ethics of helping others and the ethics of engaging in virtuous behaviour. So it's much more expansive, the ethics. And then patience here, as we saw the other day, is an undisturbed mind in the face of a difficult situation. So again, patience is not a behaviour, it's a mental attitude. It just really means to remain calm in the face of difficult situations. The fourth is joyous effort. Here this is defined as a mind that delights in virtue, or in other words, a mind that's happy to do good things. And then the fifth one, of course, is concentration, samadhi. Here in the Mahayana, again, this is often simply called shamatha practice, because that's the level of concentration we're mainly focusing on. And then again, the wisdom practice here in the Mahayana, and based on Sanskrit, is vipassana. These six perfections can also be condensed into the same three core areas of practice. Because we can condense generosity, ethics, and patience as ethics. And then we have concentration and wisdom. And then joyous effort is something we need to apply to all three. So also here in the Mahayana, we have the same three core areas of practice of ethics, concentration, and wisdom. But here in the wisdom of vipassana practice, in the Mahayana, then when we talk about vipassana practice in Mahayana, we're mainly talking about this wisdom of emptiness. Of course, vipassana here also includes impermanent suffering and no self, but then in vipassana practice in the Mahayana, they go one step further into this vipassana practice of emptiness. Translation of Sanskrit term shunyata. So emptiness here is the realization that there is no independent me, no independent objective world. In other words, emptiness is the realization that nothing exists independently, that everything is empty of existing independently. Of course, emptiness doesn't mean nothing really exists. We're not saying things are empty of existence. We're saying they're empty of independent existence. So therefore, the flip side is, therefore, things are dependently existent. And this is going to be a big topic for tomorrow. We're going to look at this, what it is, and how to cultivate that is the main topic for tomorrow.
Can you repeat what is the joyous effort?
So joyous effort is simply defined as a mind that delights in virtue. In other words, a mind that's happy to do good things. And this is something important in practice in general, because Sometimes we turn practice into some sort of hardship that we have to endure. But then we've completely missed the point. So one way to help develop this joyous effort with any practice is to reflect on the benefits of the practice. Because if we see that this practice is going to give us a lot of benefit, then we're going to be happy. We're going to be happy to do it, even if it's difficult. So that's the way one way to cultivate that joyous effort is to appreciate the benefits of the practice that we're doing. So these are the 6 perfections, and again they can be condensed into the same 3 core areas of practice. Any questions before we take a morning tea break? Yeah.
There are 4 schools of Buddhism. So all the 4 schools of Buddhism can come under the Mahayana?
As in the Nyingma, Kagyu, Sakya, Gelug, yeah. So Mahayana includes, of course, all the schools of Tibetan Buddhism, but of course includes Chinese Buddhism, Zen, Korean, Vietnamese, and so forth. Yes. Mongolia as well, and some other smaller republic areas as well.
How can we help others on the spiritual path, like us?
How can we
How
help?
can we help others on the spiritual path? Because we don't know much.
Yeah, that's what we're going to talk about this afternoon in terms of bodhicitta.
If there's no independent me and no independent world, then how does responsibility then play a part?
So if there's no independent me, independent world, how does responsibility
Kind of come into it, I guess. How do
Play a
you
part.
claim responsibility, or how is that figured out?
In fact, because there is no independent me and no independent world, that means personal responsibility. But to understand that we have to talk about a lot of things tomorrow. The short answer is that we are now stuck in what's called the 2 extremes, and we see there's only 2 possibilities. And it seems like that emptiness sort of means, well, nothing really exists, so I'm not responsible for anything, and there's no causality, But actually, that's a wrong view. That's an incorrect understanding of emptiness. The correct understanding is because of emptiness, therefore everything matters. Therefore, we have personal responsibility. But that's tomorrow.
When you become a bodhisattva?
Sorry?
When you become a bodhisattva?
You become a bodhisattva when you cultivate this bodhicitta. But as we're going to see maybe tomorrow, or even this afternoon, it's when we have this aspiration to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of others, when that is sort of naturally and continually coming up throughout the day. When we've developed it to that level, then we're really a bodhisattva. I mean, now we can sit down and reflect and meditate, and for a few moments we may go, oh yeah, I'd like to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of others. But that doesn't make us a bodhisattva. But when we keep working on that so that it's there pretty well all the time, and naturally, then we're a bodhisattva.
Does the Mahayana tradition believe that nirvana is possible?
Sure. Absolutely.
You don't need to achieve bodhicitta.
No.
You can just do.
No, sure. Absolutely.
Because there's a saying outside that says if you focus only on your happiness and not that of others, then you can't achieve genuine happiness. But I was told that Theravada is more you focus on enlightenment for yourself, not for the sake of others.
This is going to come this afternoon. Okay. Well, maybe even a bit this morning in the next session. But yes, we're going to touch on this. It's an important point. Okay, it's time for a break there. So let's take a break. Come back, and then 10:45, and then I want to look at this third vehicle, the Vajrayana or Tantra.